Night Chill Audio. Burnt Offerings, Chapter 2. The next morning, Marian called Aunt Elizabeth and told her they would be away all day Saturday. Could Ben take her to the supermarket Friday night instead? Aunt Elizabeth, who was 74, said that Friday was her poker night. Well, then what about Thursday? Art class. And Wednesday was out. She was going to the theater. Aunt Elizabeth told Marian not to worry. She could easily wheel her shopping cart the 3 blocks to the A&P. But Marian, who like Ben, assumed that a 74-year-old woman living alone must be helpless, insisted, and so they settled on Friday afternoon when Ben usually got home earlier. Aunt Elizabeth, although she didn't mention it, would have to cancel her 3 o'clock appointment at the beauty parlor. Much of Ben's reluctance to leave the city for any length of time was based, Marian knew, on Aunt Elizabeth's supposed dependence on him. She was Ben's only living relative, his father's sister. Bright, witty, and good-natured. He was devoted to her. Although she lived fairly nearby, they saw her infrequently. Her schedule always seemed to be booked solid. But at least he was there if she needed him. Which, surprisingly, she did that morning. Her air conditioner had broken down. But no rush. Friday would be fine. She wished them success with the summer house and said that her bikini and her water wings were all ready. "Are you serious, Aunt Elizabeth?" Marian asked her. "About the bikini? Of course I'm serious. Besides that, I mean, if we were to find something, would you consider spending the summer with us? In the country? As our guest. I'm sure Ben would feel a lot easier about leaving if you came along." "Well," Aunt Elizabeth said, "it certainly is an idea, isn't it?" "Well, please think about it." "I will, Marian. Kiss Davy for me, will you?" Marian hung up. That, she thought, was inspired. The temperature climbed all week, and the nightly weather report started adding triple digits and discomfort glosses to the evening banter. Wednesday, the children below the windows were playing in shorts and sundresses, their mothers exposing white arms and thighs. Ben came home sweating profusely, and one night when the building up opposite hummed with the sound of air conditioners, suggested they start thinking of one themselves, even though neither of them could stand them. Marian spent an afternoon rearranging drawers and closets, pulling out summer clothes and burying the spring and winter. The heat and noise had suddenly become invigorating. The prospect of going away for the summer delighted David, who asked Ben Thursday when he should start packing his snorkeling equipment. I hold off a while," Ben said, "and I wouldn't get my hopes up either. Chances are we won't find anything, not this year." "That's not what Mommy says," David replied. "Well, Mommy can be a little premature sometimes," Ben said, glaring across the table at Marian, who insisted she hadn't said a thing at all. Ben said little more to temper Marian's enthusiasm. There was even something encouraging in his insistence that they set up several houses to visit in addition to the very reasonable one, plainly beyond them, she seemed so inordinately excited about, which Marian did promptly, happily, and displaying an incredible elasticity of taste. They were to take the Long Island Expressway out to Riverhead. The woman on the phone had said, "Get onto Route 25 and keep going beyond Matchuk and Kuchau, and then the little Peconic Bay. Get off 25 at Orient Road. Tricky, she was told, so watch out for it." And then follows a series of secondary roads, which Marian had copied down very carefully, crossing the island until they reached Shore Road and looked for number 17. "Which is a hoot," the woman had said. "There's no 15 or 18 or anything. Just 17. Her name was Roz Allardyce, and she had sounded jovial and friendly and very interested. When Marian showed the directions to Ben, he said, "My God, are you sure you got this right?" She said, "I copied down exactly what she told me." Ben studied a map of the island and was able to follow the route up to the little Peconic Bay. "The rest we'll have to take as it comes," he said, adding, "Maybe we ought to try some of the other places first." "Oh, Ben, no," Marian pleaded. "We'll find it. I know we will." Marian had told Miss Allardyce to expect them around 11, to allow for Saturday traffic and the probability that they would get lost somewhere at the end of the island. Ben suggested they leave the apartment before 8. "Cautious as always," Marian said. "Hell, someone here's got to be." She sat next to him with the map open on her lap and the scrawled directions tucked into her tote bag. Apartment buildings, terrace most of them, rose above the expressway like palisades. Nothing like a little distance to see it clearly, the sprawling dreariness of the city, the bricked-in anonymity. Was he looking? "Awake?" she asked. "Oh, uh-huh." "Excited?" He made a whoopee sign and she hammered the side of his arm. Whether he'd admit it or not, he had accepted the idea. He was more than merely humoring her. And maybe it was the bright shirt, or the weekend, or just the three of them riding together, but already he seemed less tense, less distracted. In a while, the buildings were a gray mass behind them, like something glacial, and there were rows of small houses with trees and neat, billowy shrubs, and then houses with saplings and newly sodded lawns. The sun had come out, and the air, heavy with unseasonable humidity when they left the apartment, had now become clear. Marian rolled down her window and the air washed over David, who was burrowing in the picnic hamper behind them. "Look at all that beautiful space," she said, "and the air. Oh, just smell it, Davy." David pulled out a package of Yankee Doodles. "Are we in the country yet?" he asked. "Soon." "Riverhead," Ben said. "Where are those directions?" The directions, surprisingly enough, were accurate. They found Orient Road and then turned off onto a narrower blacktop, which soon passed through a neat and quiet cluster of small wooden buildings. A tavern, a general store, a post office, flagless, with the name Mahoxon in peeling gilt on the window. W.G. Ross, M.D. Fat. Trees lined the roads. "Bustling," Ben said. Marian said, "It's heaven." 10 minutes later, Ben slowed the car. "This has got to be it, Shore Road." "Is there a sign?" "Nope. There's also nowhere else to go." "What did the directions say?" 17 Shore Road. Thanks." They were on a narrow dirt lane, obviously little used. Deep, rich foliage pressed the road on both sides. The trees overhead seemed to lock together. It was all shimmering green and still, and somewhere beyond there was a sense of space and water. "Lovely," Marian said quietly, and Ben stopped the car for a moment and said, "God, yes." And David, who was peering over the front seat and really smelling the air for the first time, asked, "Is this the country?" The car bumped slowly over the road for a quarter of a mile or so, still no sign, no break on either side of the road. Marian was leaning forward, trying to see beyond the foliage. And finally she said, "Look, and pointed to an old stone wall half hidden under thick vines and bushes. The wall disappeared and about 50 feet away broke through the shrubbery once again. It was huge, ancient, solid. They followed it, and soon there were two massive pillars flanking a gravel drive perpendicular to the road. Marian leaned over Ben. Barely visible on one of the pillars was a bronze plate with the number 17. "Magic number," Marian said. "Turn in." Ben inched the car forward a bit and then stepped onto the brakes. He was looking down the shaded drive while dipped out of sight a little beyond the pillars. "Why are you stopping?" Marian asked. "A little intimidating, don't you think, for something so reasonable?" Before she could say it, he added, I know, negative as usual." "Drive," she said, adding a small voiced, "Please." The ad, she admitted to herself, had hardly prepared her for something so formidable. It was the entrance to an estate. She was about to say something about a gatekeeper's house or a guest cottage or possibly an apartment above a garage, but Ben had turned slowly into the drive, and she moved closer to the windshield, silent and fascinated, as the car dipped and turned and tunneled deeper through the woods. Sunlight flashed through the tall trees, and when she closed her eyes for a second, she could feel it and almost hear it hitting the car like rain. The drive narrowed even more now, and the foliage was brushing the sides of the car. Ahead, vines buried themselves under the gravel. David was kneeling in the back seat, watching the road disappear behind them. He had seen a rabbit, and something larger, he insisted, swinging through the trees. Ben saw it too, he said. "Like a gorilla?" David asked, excited. "More like a wild goose," he said, looking pointedly at Marian, who heard neither of them. There was another turn, and the growth was even thicker, the shade deeper. A dead branch had fallen halfway across the gravel. Ben steered left, pushing into the low shrubbery. There was a rustling sound, and then a small, quick slap. Ben cried out, "Jesus!" and pulled his arm off the windowsill. The car swerved right back onto the gravel. Marian threw her arm against the dashboard. "What happened?" "Goddamn twig hit me." He was rubbing his elbow against his thigh, steering with one hand. "Roll up your window." He looked at David through the rear-view mirror. "You all right, Dave?" "Saw another one," Dave said. "Real close this time. He shot at it through the rear window." The drive widened at that point and brightened. The bushes drew back from the road, and the trees grew thinner, some of them leafless and dead. Straight ahead, abruptly, the woods ended. "All clear," Marian said. She looked at his elbow, which he was holding close to his side. "We'd have to do something about those bushes," she said, and waited for the look. It came. The woods rose in back of them, solidly, rimming the great stretch of open field they were now driving through. Coarse high grass with some thickets and isolated dead trees. It was hot and silent and heavy, with the smell of weeds baking. The road, more dirt than gravel now, turned to the right, and the house that suddenly burst on them way in the distance, with the huge shimmering bay beyond it, made Marian gasp and cry, "Oh, my God!" And when David leaned forward and said incredulously, "That's our house?" she said, "Shh," so emphatically that Ben looked at her and said, "No, Dave, that is not our house, nohow." A great rambling mass of gables and dormers and rounded bays, the house was set on the highest point of land, between the water and the rising sweep of open land bleached yellow-green by the sun. It covered the hill, climbing from a broad paved drive shaded by elms and maples. Wide steps led to the central part of the house, which was fronted by a long portico and flanked by two great wings, their gables peaking above the trees. Gray and massive, with the look of generations about it, it made Marian think of buttresses and spires. And like a cathedral, there was something that ordered its complexity, a spine running through the vast length of the house. Where was it? The car had stopped and Ben was saying something to her. She felt his hand on her arm with a slight start, and when she finally pulled herself away from the house, she saw that he was nodding at something outside the car. "There it is," he said. She looked to her right. Set back from the road was a small cottage, shuttered and overgrown with vines. Weeds grew high, buzzing with insects, and covering the path to the small, rickety porch. The house had stunned her, and it was a moment before she could ask, "There's what?" "Our unique summer place," she heard Ben say. "The reasonable one." She was looking back at the house. One of the wings was rounded with French doors. She could count 5, opening out onto a terrace. And somewhere in the rear, in partial view, was a solarium or greenhouse. "Incredible," she said. "Oh, this is just incredible, isn't it?" But he had opened the door and was climbing out of the car, saying, "Well, we've come this far." David pushed the front seat forward and followed him. "Where are you going?" she called out the window. "Snoop." He passed in front of the car. David was fighting his way through the weeds, slashing the air and making machete sounds. Ben opened the door for her and swept his hand toward the cottage. "Just what we've always wanted, right? A little vine-choked cottage." "Care to look?" She did quickly without leaving the car. "Oh, this can't be it," she said, looking at him for confirmation. "Who says? It's a cinch that isn't." He looked at the main house. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" she said. Her voice was low and reverent. "Not on dry land, I haven't." He pushed the door shut, leaned in, and tried to kiss her cheek. "Hey, baby." He turned her face away from the house toward him. "Let's not think too much, huh? Not this year anyway." She smiled a little guiltily. He moved away from her and stepped into the weeds, calling, "Dave, where'd you go?" "Ben," she called out, "maybe you shouldn't." "Why not?" He slapped something on his wrist. "It'll save them a pitch." He climbed up to the porch, bounced a few times for her benefit, and then grabbed for support. The door, when he was thrown, clowning, was locked, and so were the shutters tight. Marian watched him disappear around the side of the house. He was probably right, she realized. It was the cottage, and yet hadn't the ad said something about a large family? She pulled the torn page out of her tote bag, and yes, that was exactly what it said, suitable for large family. The cottage was small, 3 or 4 rooms at most. Besides, who'd attempt to rent a wreck like that? She folded the paper and slipped it back into her bag. "It's the house," she said aloud. "That incredible house." She settled back in the seat and stared ahead, reassured. Her eyes rode along the curve and angles of the house. There was a small shaded porch outside one of the upper rooms and rested on a huge rounded bay under the west gable. It rose a floor above the rest of the house, isolated, jutting about the water and the opposite shore, which was the thin pastel line. And that was it, wasn't it? The spine, the focal point, the whole thrust of the house was toward the gable and those blank windows. The closer she looked at those windows, the lovelier and more irresistible the house became. "It's the house," she repeated. "What's the house?" He startled her. He was standing beside her outside the car. "Oh, just thinking out loud. See anything?" "Nothing," he said, sealed tight. "I can see all sorts of possibilities, though. Malaria and encephalitis. We're wasting our time, babe." "Maybe it's not the cottage," Marion said. "Could be the house, couldn't it?" "In that case, we're really wasting our time." He raised his hands to his mouth. "Let's go, Dave," he called. David came running through the weeds. Ben Crouch reached to cut him off. He grabbed him as he leaped out into the drive, swinging the boy over his shoulder and carrying him squealing with pleasure back to the car. Marion tensed. That kind of rough stuff made her nervous. "When you two are through horsing around," she said. They climbed in, and Ben started the car, saying, "Here goes nothing." David leaned forward between them. "I saw a bike in the weeds," he said. "A three-wheeler." "Must be kids around," Ben said over his shoulder. I don't think so. It was all busted up." He waited and then added, "There was blood all over it." "No kidding," Ben said. He used his scariest voice. "Dried up blood." Ben shuddered. "Wowie!" he cried. "Think it was some kind of gorilla blood." "Gorillas don't ride three-wheelers." "That's what the coming up behind us," Ben asked. David turned and looked out the rear window. "A two-wheeler," he said, "with training wheels." Mary stared intently in the upper window, said to herself, please let it be the house. Please let this be the house. For some distance, the drive skirted the field, which must have once been a vast and manicured lawn, terraced as it rose toward the house. There were traces of thin, low retaining walls. To the right, before the woods began, was a narrow piece of open land, formerly planted at one time. There was a vague pattern of shrubs and hedges, gone to ruin, surrounding the remains of a delicate summer pavilion. What a shame, Marion thought, and the house as they drew closer. That was more than a shame. Oh, a crime, a genuine old-fashioned mortal sin. It was still overwhelming, more so as it loomed larger and its details became more distinct. Carved medallions and multi-lioned windows and the shapes of the columns of the upper porch. Oh, but the roof-tiled rippled and the shingles once white were dirty gray and broken with ancient rust stains. Some of the windows had been patched with cardboard, and the balusters running up the central steps were tilting. Many of them, or were missing. One lay buried in the scrawny shrub beside the steps, and for every tree that billowed so impressively from a distance, there were two that were bony and long dead. Oh, God, what a waste, Marion said as Ben drove past a 5-car garage with an upper story. There was a huge old Packard parked in front of one of the garages, whose doors hung open very loosely. The car seemed packed tight with boxes and lampshades and bits of furniture. A wooden headboard was tied at the top, and the trunk was open. "What time were they expecting us?" Ben asked. 11. "We got half an hour." "They won't mind." He stopped the car in front of the house. The drive was paved very thin with gravel. When they got out, the house stretched and towered before them, and on the other side the wide field rolled back in the woods, which were a solid wall of green. The steps squeaked, all of them. 16, according to David, who bounced on one until Marion grabbed him and whispered, "David!" She stopped Ben near the top. "Oh, I'm nervous," she said. "I don't see why," he replied. He climbed ahead, up to the portico. The columns were high and round and peeling, the porch broad and shaded. Almost as soon as Ben knocked, the door was pulled open by a short old man, pink, round, and panting. He was wearing a peaked cap, sweat-stained, ballooning trousers, and a tank top undershirt. A small nipple peered out beside the worn strap. "We're the Rolfs," Ben said. "We come about the summer place." Marian crossed the porch. She was smiling tightly and still holding on to David. I know, the man said. He was having trouble catching his breath. "Been expecting you. I'm Walker, the handyman." He chuckled as though it were some private joke. "Oh, come on in." He opened the door wider. Ben motioned Marian and David in first. "You folks can wait in the parlor while I go find their nipses," Walker said. When he turned, there was a large and dirty dust cloth trailing from his back pocket. David pulled loose as Marian stood motionless in the entrance hall. The chandelier caught her eye first. A great cluster of crystal, Waterford, no doubt, hung high above the bare wooden floor. The droplets were cloudy, and the floor dull and scraped. There was a large oriental rug rolled up against one wall. Still, the hall was impressive, almost as large as their whole apartment. A magnificent staircase, carved mahogany, curved up to the second floor near the base, and following the curve up and out of sight was a metal band, like a track. "Marian?" Ben was waiting outside the double doors Walker had just opened. "Yes, coming." She tried to absorb the details. Double doors on either side of the hall, which narrowed to a passageway beside the staircase. Rooms beyond. Dining room. Kitchen. Library. The greenhouse. She had never been in a house anything like this. The layout, she visualized, was strictly Hollywood, grand, but gone, or going to seed. And again, what a pity. What Walker referred to as the parlor was even more impressive. An enormous sun-filled room, rounded at once, end and cut with the French door she had seen as they approached the house. An aubusson was in the middle of the room, off-white, while pale rose and blue flowers. The walls were all antique bosserie, white and gold, and over the scrolled mantel of the fireplace was a Chippendale mirror that made her gasp. And God, why was the rug so worn, and the walls peeling, and the drapes so heavy with dust? If someone had had the taste to collect so much exquisite crystal and silver, then why weren't they responsible enough to keep it polished and gleaming? "Make yourself at home," Walker was saying. "Just watch where you sit. Lots of old stuff in here." He pulled the dust cloth out of his back pocket and passed it perfunctorily over a gilt console. He was moving toward one of the windows. "Musty," he said, sniffing. Marian stood next to Ben, her eyes traveling over the room. She took his hand and squeezed it, as if to say, "Oh, please help me." "Cozy," Ben said, and then stage whispered, "Money. Very old money." David was at the other end of the room, watching Walker struggle with the window. "Hey," he called out suddenly, "they got a boat!" The window opened with a wrench, and a breeze flew in the room, knocking a fluted shade off a lamp. "Look at that view! Wow!" And Walker said, "Look at the view if you want." He lifted the shade, pulled the plug, and stuck the lamp under his arm. David became more excited. "Daddy, they got a boat!" he cried. "Busted," Walker said. Ben had come to the window. "Where's the pool?" the ad mentioned. "Can't see it from the house," Walker said. He waved vaguely. "It's down over yonder." Ben looked out beyond the terrace and the lawn sloped down to the bay, where he could see a twisted pier and a small cabin cruiser jutting up, waterlogged. There had been a formal gardens at one time, with a large stone fountain in the center. What a waste is right, he thought. Marion had found a coral lacquer secretary, beautifully embellished with black and gold figures. Against the inside wall, she touched it, hesitantly at first, absorbed in the detail. Her hand followed the cool, polished curve, very lightly, reaching the small finial. One piece tucked away in a corner, and it was worth more than everything they had or ever would have, as far as she could see. Oh, to be able to live with something so beautiful, not own, merely just live with for a month, 2 months, God! David's voice broke in. How come your plants are all dead? He was asking. She looked away from the secretary and was startled to see Walker, David next to him, watching her and smiling. She moved away self-consciously. I couldn't help admiring it, she apologized. It's so lovely. Walker kept smiling at her, and David said, Your front steps are busted, too. David, she smiled feebly in Walker's direction. Why was he watching her like that? Everything's busted around here, Walker said, and finally looked away from her, adjusting the lamp under his arm. Ben had stepped out onto the terrace. Go with Daddy, Marion said, calling. Easy, easy, and he ran across the room. It's all right, isn't it? She asked Walker. Sure, look over the place if you want. He was beginning to leave the room. How old is the house? Marion asked. Walker stopped and shrugged. Who knows? He noticed something across the room. Heck, he said. He came back into Marion and placed the lamp and shade next to her on the floor. Watch this stuff a minute, will ya? There was a large landscape, elaborately framed, hanging from the sofa. He walked toward it, small, quick steps as though he were used to sudden obstructions, knelt on the sofa and reached up to straighten the picture, make it even more crooked. Better, he said, inspecting the picture, and as he came back to her, it crashed to the floor behind the sofa. Before she knew it, Marion cried out, Walker! Her tone was inexplicably and unexplainably sharp and proprietary, and immediately one hand went up to her mouth. Walker looked stunned for just a second, and then there were the traces of a smile. Yes, ma'am, he said, quietly and evenly. Her fingers remained over her lips. Why had she said that? Why had it burst out so instinctively? Whatever there was of a small faded, and he was standing in front of her now, still and submissive. It's not, oh, there's no damage, is there? She said lamely, but at least the words broke his stare and the uncomfortable silence. He muttered something apologetic, turning and climbing back onto the couch, bringing the picture up with a series of grunts. Busted, he said, red-faced with the effort. A lot of things fall apart around here, he said, dragging the picture behind him. He gestured for the lamps. Ma'am, she handed it to him, and it went under his arm. He mentioned something again about their nipses, still very hang-dog, and left the room, closing the double doors behind him. Marion stared after him, thinking, please don't let him come with the house. Not a clod like that. She raised her eyes to the ceiling and followed the carved patterns, the detail grimy and vague, down the length of the room. If Walker is a condition, then this room at least is out of bounds. There was an alcove at the opposite end of the room, which she headed for, cataloging the furniture and the bric-a-brac. Someone called yellow and blue Meissen, and she passed them. Ben was calling her from the terrace, something about the view. In a minute, she called back. She looked into the alcove and saw a glass door, clouded and dirty. The greenhouse. She could just about make out the long shelves and tables behind the glass. Should she? Why not? The heat and the rotting smell hit her as soon as she managed to pull the door open. The glass walls and the roof were gray, crusted with dirt. Warped shelves and sagging tables extended the length of the greenhouse, were filled with dull orange pots, empty, most of them, or trailing stiff brown vines. There were pots on the dirt floor, shattered and rusted tools. Despite the smell and the heat, she moved deeper into the room, dipping her fingers into a pot, picking off a petrified flower. Oh, it was appalling, and God damn it, she'd think of some way to tell them that. What's another word for appalling? The second time Ben called Marian, she heard him. The smell kept him from just outside the greenhouse door. "Oh, for Christ's sake, what are you doing?" "Oh, look at it," she said, poking inside a clay pot. "Every plant is dead. Soil like powder." "Look, you wouldn't like strangers nosing around your rubber plants. Come out of there." She looked over the room once more, gave a long sigh, and came toward him. "It kills me. Such a waste. It just kills me." She gave a low scream and hammered his chest with both fists. "Stop taking it so personally." "I can't help it," she tried to block it out. "I thought you were watching David. He went down to look at the beach." She was standing in the doorway, giving the littered shelves one final frustrated look. They might not like that. "They sure as hell won't like this. Out!" He pushed the door shut. She looked out over the terrace and saw David running toward the beach. He stopped, picked up a stone, and scaled it toward the water. "I don't know whether that's a very good idea," she said to Ben, and then noticed that he was not behind her. "Will David be all right?" she asked louder, and heard him call, "Yeah," from the alcove. The terrace was paved with flagstone. Weeds grew between and through the stones, and wound around the balusters, barely supporting the cracked ledge that bordered the terrace. The garden furniture was, of course, unusable, but that view and the space. "Hey, you see these?" Ben called from the alcove. She hadn't. Opposite the greenhouse door was a wall filled with pictures, photographs, 20 or 30 of them. He was crouching in front of them. "Weird," he said. "They're all the same." Marian came beside him and looked at the pictures. They were arranged in neat rows, almost covering the wall. Each of the photograph was the same size, with the same thin silver frame, and, as Ben had indicated, exactly the same view of the house, looking toward the front from the hallway across the wide field. Some seem older, sepia-toned, with black and white shots in the middle of the wall, and then there's color prints hanging to the right. "Notice anything?" he asked her. The house, especially in the color prints, gleamed pure white against the lawn and the bay beyond. The rails and the balustrades were whole, the windows unbroken. Nothing seemed patched or faded or crumbling. The trees shading the house were full, and there were beautifully sculpted hedges. It was exactly the way it should have been, and obviously was at some time. Overwhelming. Ben stood up. "Crazy, no?" he said. Marian was studying the pictures. "Yes," she said. "Pity they let it all fall apart." Somewhere in the house a door slammed shut, and there were raised voices. "Here they come!" He grabbed Marian's arm and lifted her to her feet. "Now remember," he said, "I'll do the talking. Just look pretty and keep your damn mouth shut." She took a minute to think about it. Ben was holding her with both hands now. "Marian," he warned. It was his negative voice. "The cottage is out, okay? Queens or no queens." She smiled. "I'm with you, Benji," she said. "The cottage won't do." Now that's my girl. Just leave the graceful exits to me.